Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm going to set this one up a little differently because this story doesn't start where you might expect. There's no dating app, no bar in Cebu, no profile picture that seemed too good to be true. This story starts in a hardware store. A man browsing wall fittings, and the thing that eventually unravels everything isn't a private investigator, isn't a suspicious friend back home, isn't even a phone he wasn't supposed to find. It's a language he was never supposed to speak. Wolfgang is 65 years old. He's a retired plumber from the Ruhr Valley in western Germany. 40 years in the trade. The kind of man who, when something breaks, fixes it. And when he can't fix it, it genuinely troubles him at a level most people reserve for moral failures. He came to the Philippines the same way he approached everything in his life, with a spreadsheet and 8 months of research. What happened to him out here is going to stay with me for a while. I think it'll stay with you too. Here's his story, in his own words. My name is Wolfgang. I am 65. I was a plumber for 40 years in Bochum, which is in the Ruhr. Industrial western Germany, coal and steel country, very flat, very gray in winter, very gray also in summer, if I am honest. It is not a beautiful place, but it is a place where things work, and where people who are good at making things work are respected. I was respected. That was enough for me for a long time. I retired at 62. My wife Ingrid was already sick by then. She had been sick for 4 years. I don't want to spend too much time on this part. Not because it doesn't matter. It matters more than anything. But because I find I don't have the right words for it, even now. And I am suspicious of men who do. What I can tell you is the practical reality. Breast cancer. 4 years from diagnosis. The last 18 months I was her full-time carer, which means I was at home every day, all day, managing medications and appointments, and the 100 small indignities that come with serious illness. I kept the house very clean. That was the one thing I could control completely. The floors, the kitchen, the bathroom, everything else was beyond me. But the floors I could do something about. She died in March 2021. I sold the house in Bochum that September. People thought this was strange. Too fast. Maybe a sign I wasn't grieving properly. But the house had a smell. Not an unpleasant smell, not exactly. Just the particular smell of illness lived in over a long time. Medication and hospital supply deliveries and the specific quality of air in a room where someone is very slowly not recovering. I could not sleep in that smell, so I sold it, and I moved to a rented flat in Dortmund, and I sat there with 155,000 euros in a bank account and a pension of about 1,400 euros a month, and I tried to understand what I was supposed to do next. This is not a dramatic statement. I am not describing a breakdown. I was functioning. I was eating, sleeping, going to the supermarket. I had simply been a man with a very specific purpose for 40 years. Fix the problem in front of you. And then for 4 years after that, I had another very specific purpose, which was to keep Ingrid as comfortable and as dignified as possible. And then that was finished, and I was 63 years old, and there was no next problem on the list. My colleague Klaus retired a year before me. Electrician, similar background. We'd known each other since our 30s. He moved to Cebu City in the Philippines in 2021, which I thought at the time was frankly eccentric. Klaus had always been slightly eccentric. But then the photos started arriving on WhatsApp. Grilled fish on a table by the water. The harbor at Mactan at sunset, all oranges and pinks. Klaus himself, grinning in a way I genuinely had not seen him grin in perhaps 15 years. He looked, I don't know how else to say it, lighter. like someone had removed a coat he'd been wearing so long he forgot it was there. I looked at those photos for about 6 months without doing anything. That is my nature. Then, in the autumn of 2022, I opened a spreadsheet. I want you to understand that this is not a joke or a figure of speech. I made an actual spreadsheet. Cost of living in Cebu versus Dortmund. Visa requirements and extension procedures. I emailed the Philippine Bureau of Immigration directly because I don't trust second-hand information. International transfer fees from my German bank. Healthcare costs. The SRRV visa deposit requirements. I cross-referenced everything Klaus told me against independent sources because Klaus, while a good man, has always been an optimist in a way that I am not. I also read the horror stories. There are many forums on the internet where Western men describe losing their savings to Filipino women. And I read all of these with the same attention I gave the positive accounts. I made notes. I looked for patterns. I thought, I am not naive. I am not lonely in a way that impairs my judgment. I am a man who reads the manual before touching anything, and I will approach this the same way. I know. I booked a flight in January 2023. 30-day tourist visa. I told myself it was a holiday. I told Klaus it was just a look around. No commitment. Purely to satisfy my curiosity before crossing it off the list. Klaus picked me up from Mactan Airport in a grab car at 11 at night, and the heat when I stepped outside the terminal was... I had prepared for heat logically. I knew the temperature statistics, but statistics don't prepare you for the actual physical sensation of air that seems to have weight. It pressed against my face like something solid. The road from the airport had this smell of diesel, and something frying, and the sea, all mixed together. I found it, genuinely, not unpleasant. Klaus had found me a guest house in a residential neighborhood, rather than the tourist areas near the waterfront. Quieter, he said. More normal. A side street off one of the main roads, the kind of street with a sari-sari store on one corner and a basketball court with a broken backboard on the other. And at 4 in the morning, 2 days after I arrived, a rooster somewhere very nearby that I had not budgeted for in my research. I lay in that room, listening to this rooster, too warm despite the air conditioning unit doing its best. And I thought, I have no idea what I am doing here. Which was true. But I also thought, and I remember this specifically, I thought, at least I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. That was different from Dortmund. In Dortmund, I knew exactly what I was supposed to be doing, and I had no interest in any of it. The guest house was fine. Clean, which matters to me. A small restaurant attached to it that did a good breakfast. The neighborhood was ordinary in a way I found easier than the tourist areas Klaus had initially suggested. I am not a man who enjoys being obviously a tourist, being looked at, being sold things. Here, nobody was especially interested in me. I was just a large German man who walked everywhere slowly and studied the street food vendors with perhaps excessive seriousness. The hardware store was 2 streets away. I found it in my second week because I needed a specific wall fitting. The bracket holding a small shelf in my room had been installed incorrectly. Whoever put it in had used the wrong rawl plug for the wall type, which is a basic error. The kind of thing that takes 30 seconds longer to do correctly and saves considerable trouble later. I asked at the guest house desk, and they pointed me down the road. Small shop, painted yellow, metal shelving visible through the open front. Her name was Grace. But I am getting ahead of myself. I am 65 years old, and I have been a plumber for 40 years. And I know that before you can diagnose a problem, you have to understand the system it's operating in. So let me explain the system. Let me explain what I thought I was walking into and what I actually was. Because those are not the same thing. and understanding why they're different, that took me 2 years, one small notebook, and a language I was never supposed to know. The hardware store was called, if I remember correctly, something like Reyes General Hardware. No sign of particular distinction. Yellow paint that had been yellow for perhaps 15 years. The kind of shop where the stock is organized in a system that makes complete sense to the person who organized it and to nobody else. Boxes of fittings stacked on top of pipe sections, stacked on top of electrical supplies. A bag of cement mix sitting in the corner for no obvious reason. I felt immediately comfortable. It reminded me of every tradesman's supplier I had ever visited, which is to say, it reminded me of my whole working life. Grace was behind the counter on a stool, writing something in a ledger. Not a computer, an actual paper ledger, columns of figures in neat handwriting. She looked up when I came in. She did not smile in the way that shop workers smile when they see a foreign face, the particular wide smile that is actually the calculation of a potential sale. She just looked up, noted I was there, and waited to see what I needed. I explained what I was looking for. My English is functional, but I speak it precisely, choosing each word carefully, which sometimes makes people think I am being formal when I am simply being accurate. She listened without any sign of impatience, asked one clarifying question about wall material, concrete or hollow block, and then stood up and found the correct fitting in approximately 20 seconds from a shelf I could not have identified in 20 minutes. That was the whole transaction. She told me the price. 45 pesos, less than €1. I paid. I said thank you. She said, "You're welcome, Po," and sat back down with her ledger. I walked back to the guest house and fixed the bracket. Took me 4 minutes. The shelf was solid. I was satisfied. I went back 2 days later for caulking sealant, which I told myself I needed for a gap around the bathroom window frame. This was partly true. This time there was a brief conversation. She asked if the fitting had worked. I said yes. She made a small observation. She said the local sealant brands were, in her opinion, not very reliable, that the imported ones were better, but cost 3 times as much, and most customers didn't want to hear that. She said this with a mild expression, neither complaining nor amused, simply stating a professional opinion. I told her I would take the imported one. She found it without comment. I am describing this in detail because I want you to understand what was and was not happening. There was nothing romantic about these first 2 visits. I was not looking at her as a romantic prospect. I was a 63-year-old German widower buying hardware supplies from a shop assistant who was good at her job. That was all. And I think I have thought about this quite a bit. I think that is precisely why it proceeded the way it did. There was no performance on either side. We were just 2 people who both understood the correct use of wall fittings, which is a more solid foundation than it sounds. I came back a 3rd time. Some sandpaper, I think. Or maybe screws. I don't remember exactly. And that is itself interesting to me. By the 3rd visit, I was no longer fully tracking my reasons. Over the remaining 2 weeks of the trip, we spoke maybe 6 or 7 times in total. Always in the shop, always brief, always with the counter between us. She told me she had worked there for 3 years. The owner was a cousin of her late husband. She had a son, Nico, 15, studying at a school nearby. She said all of this without particular emotion, as biographical information rather than appeal. She did not ask me anything personal except, once, whether I was visiting for long. I said I wasn't sure. She nodded, as if this was a reasonable answer. I want to be very clear about one thing. In all of these conversations, she never once mentioned money. never asked where I was staying or how I was finding the Philippines in the way that leads somewhere. Never made any reference to my being foreign beyond the one practical question about the wall material. I had read enough forum posts by that point to know the patterns, the quick warmth, the flattery, the manufactured intimacy. None of that was present. What was present was something much simpler, and, for me, much more disarming. She was just a competent woman doing a job carefully, who occasionally said something dry and accurate about sealant. The day before I flew back to Germany, I went in again. I had no particular reason. I bought a small packet of cable ties I genuinely did not need. And before I left, I asked if I could add her on Facebook. I said it the way you say something when you are not entirely sure you should be saying it. Quickly, not quite looking at her. She said yes. And then she said, in that same level tone, "I am not looking for anything complicated. My life is already full." I walked back to the guest house in the February heat. The air smelled like the street food stall on the corner, some kind of grilled meat and charcoal. A Mang Inasal had just opened on the main road, and the smoke drifted down the side street. And I thought about what she had said, and I found it. And this is the truth. Profoundly reassuring. Not discouraging. Reassuring. Because it sounded like a woman who was not running any kind of operation. A woman who wanted things to be clear from the start. I interpreted honesty as the absence of an agenda. I was not wrong that she was being honest. I may have been wrong about what the honesty meant. I flew back to Germany in early March. The cold when I landed in Frankfurt was physical, a wall of it, and I stood outside the terminal for a moment before getting a taxi, and I thought, well, that was something. I did not know yet what it was, but I had Klaus's photos on my phone, and I had a Facebook friend request pending somewhere on a server, and I had the memory of a woman in a yellow-painted shop who told me without being asked that she was not looking for anything complicated. I thought about that sentence quite a lot on the flight home. I am not looking for anything complicated. In German, we have a word, übersichtlich, which means something like clear or easy to survey, a situation where you can see all the components at once. I think that is what I wanted. Something übersichtlich, something I could see the edges of. I should have paid more attention to the fact that she was describing her own preferences, not mine. Back in Dortmund, the flat felt smaller than I remembered. This is not unusual after travel. You return, and the familiar space has contracted somehow, as if your absence taught it to occupy less room. But this time, it was not just smaller. It was quieter, in a way that had weight. I accepted her Facebook friend request the evening I landed. She had sent a brief message. "Safe flight, Po?" I replied that yes, the flight was fine, thank you. She sent a thumbs up. That was it for 3 days. I found this, again, reassuring. I had heard about the women who message constantly from the first day, the stream of good morning texts and hearts, and gentle references to needing things. Grace did not do this. She messaged when she had something to say, which was infrequently, and her messages were brief and factual. A photo of Nico's school project. A note that the hardware store had received a new stock of the imported sealant I had purchased. That was approximately the level of our communication for the first month. I messaged her in early April to ask how things were. We had a short conversation via Messenger. She typed carefully, full sentences, correct punctuation, which I noticed because most people do not bother. By May, we were talking perhaps twice a week. By June, 3 or 4 times. I am not sure exactly when it became every evening. It happened gradually, the way a pipe wears. You don't see the erosion, You just one day notice that the pressure has changed. She usually called at 9 o'clock my time, which was 3 in the morning in Cebu. I pointed this out once, that it was very late for her. She said she slept better after they talked. I did not interrogate this. I should have, perhaps, asked myself more carefully why a 38-year-old woman with a teenage son and a full working day was choosing to stay up until 3 in the morning to speak to a 63-year-old German man she had met 6 times over a shop counter. I think I knew the answer was complicated. I preferred to accept the simpler interpretation, which was that she genuinely wanted to. The calls were not romantic in any dramatic sense. We talked about ordinary things. She described her neighborhood, a barangay on the edges of Cebu City, not the tourist parts, not the polished Ayala area, just houses and sari-sari stores and the smell of someone always cooking nearby. She described Nico's moods, his interest in basketball, his school friendships. She asked me questions about Germany, what winters were like, whether it was true that everything closed on Sundays, what I missed. I told her honestly, not very much. She said she had never been anywhere cold. I said she would not enjoy it. She said perhaps not, but she would like to decide for herself. I liked that answer. In July, she mentioned, in a message rather than a call, that the new school term was coming, and that the supply fees were more than she had expected. Notebooks, uniforms, a required textbook that the school did not provide. She gave me the figure, 15,000 pesos, about 250 euros. She did not ask me for it. She presented it as information, the way she presented most things, matter-of-factly, and then she moved the conversation on to something else. I transferred the money 2 days later, via Wise, to her GCash account. She thanked me simply, said it was very kind, and did not mention it again. I remember sitting with my phone after sending it and thinking, this is not so much. In Germany, 250 euros is a moderately expensive dinner for 2 people. I had just paid for a boy's education supplies for a term. It felt, proportionate is the wrong word. It felt like the right size for the situation. I am aware, from this distance, of how these things work. The first transfer is always small. Small enough to be generous rather than obligating. Small enough that you can tell yourself it doesn't mean anything particular. It's just a reasonable thing to do for a person whose situation you know. I am not saying this was a calculated move on her part. One genuinely do not know. What I know is the effect. It made me feel useful. And I had not felt useful in a specific way to a specific person since Ingrid died, and I had not fully understood until that moment how much I needed to. By October, I was extending my Dortmund flat on monthly rolling contracts. I told the landlord I might be traveling. This was accurate in the sense that the words were true and misleading in the sense that it implied uncertainty I did not actually feel. I had more or less decided. I simply had not yet admitted it to myself formally, because I am a man who distrusts decisions made on feeling rather than evidence. And the evidence I had was some phone calls, some messages, one money transfer, and a woman I had spoken to in person perhaps 6 times across a shop counter. But there was also this. In those evening calls, Grace never pretended to be something she wasn't. She was consistent. She complained about things, the cost of electricity, a difficult customer, her mother's knee pain, but without drama, without manipulation. She talked about her late husband occasionally, briefly, without performing grief. She was curious about my life without being flattering about it. She once said, fairly directly, that she found most German men she had read about to be very serious, and that this seemed like it might be tiring to live with. I said that it was probably accurate. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a social one. I had already learned to distinguish between them. I booked the return flight in November for a December arrival. One-way ticket. Klaus met me again at Mactan Airport. He did not say "I told you so," because Klaus is a decent man, but I could see him making the effort not to. He asked if I had made arrangements. I said I had found an apartment. 18,000 pesos a month, roughly 300 euros. A small place in the same neighborhood as the guest house, not far from the hardware store. He nodded. He said, "You know it's different when you live here." I said I understood that. Grace met me at the arrivals gate with Nico. I had seen her face on a screen for 9 months, and the in-person version was slightly different in the way that photographs are always slightly different from the person. Not worse, just more specific. She was quieter than she was on calls, more formal. Nico shook my hand very correctly, like a boy who had been told to make a good impression and had taken the instructions seriously. They helped me find a grab back to the neighborhood. Grace carried one of my bags without asking. We ate that evening at a carinderia near her place. Rice, adobo, some vegetables I didn't recognize, a bottle of San Miguel. She and Nico ordered for me without fuss. The food was good. I paid. Of course I paid. I was the guest, and she was the host, and in any case, the bill came to perhaps 450 pesos for the 3 of us, not quite 8 euros. I handed over a 500 peso note and told them to keep the change, and Grace looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and something more measured. I think now that she was calculating. Not coldly. I don't mean it coldly. But she was a woman who had survived on careful accounting for years, who ran a ledger in neat columns, who knew the value of things. She was looking at me and doing a calculation. And whatever result she arrived at, she set her chopsticks down and said, "Welcome to Cebu, Wolfgang. I am glad you came back." I believed her. Both things, I still think, were probably true. I want to tell you something about the Tagalog lessons, because they are important, and because I have not been fully honest yet about why I started them. I downloaded the app in Dortmund in the autumn of 2022, before I had even booked the flight. I told myself it was preparation, the same instinct that had me emailing the Bureau of Immigration and building the spreadsheet. If I was going to a place, I should understand something about how it functions, and language is part of how a place functions. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I have spent 40 years working in other people's homes, and in other people's homes, you hear things. Conversations not meant for you. Arguments through walls. The particular quality of silence that tells you something has been said recently that cannot be unsaid. I learned very early in my career to notice what people were not showing me. The damp patch painted over, the repair done incorrectly, and then hidden. I am a man who wants to see what is actually there. The Tagalog was part of that. Some part of me, even before I met Grace, wanted to be able to hear what was being said. I am not proud of this reasoning, but I think it is accurate. By the time I moved to Cebu in December 2023, I had been studying for 14 months. 2 workbooks, a conversation tutor in Manila I met by Zoom twice a week, the app every morning with coffee. I understood perhaps 40% of spoken Tagalog in natural conversation. Less when people spoke quickly, more when they were careful. Enough to follow the shape of things, not enough to be certain of details. I never told Grace. It did not come up, and I did not raise it. And over time, the not telling became a habit, and then a position, and then a kind of low-level dishonesty I occasionally felt uncomfortable about, and mostly did not examine too carefully. So, January 2024. I am living in the apartment, 18,000 pesos a month. 300 euros, a perfectly reasonable sum. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, clean enough for my standards, which are quite high. I am spending most days with Grace. We have fallen into something that functions like domesticity. Breakfast sometimes at her house, evenings together, shopping together at the Gaisano Mall on Saturday mornings. Nico is around on weekends. He is a quiet boy, polite, not unfriendly, occupied primarily with his phone and a group of school friends I never fully distinguished from one another. He called me Kuya Wolfgang sometimes, which Klaus told me was a respectful older brother address. I found this unexpectedly pleasing. In January, Grace's mother, a small, serious woman named Liling, who lived 3 streets away and regarded me with cautious approval, developed a problem with her eyesight. Cataracts, both eyes, the left one, urgent. Grace told me this on a Tuesday evening, presenting the information with the same economy she used for everything. Her mother needed surgery. The doctor at the hospital near SM Seaside had quoted 80,000 pesos for the procedure, roughly 1,300 euros. Her savings could cover perhaps half. She was telling me, she said, because she thought I should know, not because she was asking. I transferred the 80,000 pesos within the week. I want to be clear. This was not a scam. I went with Grace to the hospital. I sat in the waiting area for 3 hours while the procedure was done. I met the surgeon. The operation was real, the recovery was straightforward, and Liling's sight improved significantly. The following Sunday, she cooked me sinigang, a sour tamarind soup with pork, very good, and pressed my hand before I left, and said something in Cebuano that Grace translated as, "God gave you to us." I did not know what to do with this. I noted it carefully, the way I noted most things. What I can tell you is that the gratitude from the family in those weeks was genuine, not performed. Liling started calling me by name rather than just nodding when I arrived. Grace's brother Remy, the younger one, irregular construction work, started stopping by more often. The older brother Dindo I saw less. The family's warmth expanded noticeably, which I noticed, and which I understood was at least partly connected to the money, and which I accepted anyway because I am not a person who requires that affection be unentangled from practicality. Ingrid and I built a life together over 40 years that included shared finances and shared burdens, and the warmth we felt for each other was not less real for also being functional. I applied this framework to Grace's family. I am not certain the framework was wrong, exactly. I think it was incomplete. In March, Nico's school fees came due. 45,000 pesos for the term, about 750 euros. This one Grace did ask me for directly, which felt, by that point, like progress of a kind. Less performance around it. She said, "Can you help with Nico's school?" I said yes. I sent it via Gcash the same day. Nico got his grades that term and passed everything, which Grace showed me on her phone with genuine pride. Running total at this point, not counting my own living expenses, approximately 140,000 pesos, roughly 2,250 euros, across 4 months. My pension was covering my apartment and food comfortably. My savings were untouched. This felt, to me, manageable, proportionate even. I was living in this city. I was part of this family's life in some way, and this was what that cost. I had seen the numbers on the forum posts. Men losing millions of pesos. Men remortgaging houses in Birmingham or Brisbane to build concrete mansions on family land they would never legally own. Compared to those stories, I was doing very well. And then, in June, Remy came to lunch. Remy is 32. He has a pleasant manner and a mobile face that shows everything he is feeling, which I found easier to read than most people. He talked through lunch about a business idea he had, a tricycle for hire, one of those passenger motorcycle sidecars you see everywhere on the side streets. He had found a unit he could lease, he had calculated the earnings, he had spoken to other drivers. He needed 60,000 pesos to secure the lease. About 1,000 euros. Grace did not advocate for him during the meal. She was quiet, which I noticed. Afterward, when Remy had gone, she said simply, "He is trying to do something real." Then she said nothing else. I thought about it for 2 days. This was the first request involving someone I did not know well. Not Grace, not Nico, not Liling, whose sight I had watched restored. Remy was a pleasant stranger who happened to be Grace's brother. I paid because I was living in a country where 60,000 pesos can change the trajectory of a person's livelihood, and because refusing would have made everything in the house uncomfortable in a way I did not want. But I noted it afterward in a way I had not noted the others. Not suspicious, exactly. More like attentive. The way you are when you hear a sound in a pipe you cannot immediately identify. You write it down. You wait to see if it recurs. I had, by this point, a small notebook. Blue cover, the kind you buy at National Bookstore for 35 pesos. I had started it as a Tagalog vocabulary journal. New words, phrases my tutor had corrected, things I had overheard and wanted to look up later. Useful. Ordinary. After the Remy lunch, I wrote one line at the bottom of a page that had nothing to do with vocabulary. The date, the amount, and a question I did not know how to answer. The question was, is this the system? Or is this the exception? I did not know yet, but I was, at least, beginning to ask. The summer of 2024 was, by most measures, a good period. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. I am not describing a story where everything was miserable, and I was simply too stubborn to leave. There were months when this life was genuinely what I had hoped it might be, when I sat in that flat in Dortmund, looking at Klaus's photographs. Grace and I took a ferry to Bohol in August. 3 days. We stayed in a small guest house near Alona Beach on Panglao Island. 1,800 pesos a night. About 29 euros. A clean room with a ceiling fan, and a view of the water if you stood on the balcony and leaned slightly to the left. We ate fresh tuna at a restaurant on the beach. We rented a scooter and drove to see the Chocolate Hills, those strange rounded mounds that spread across the interior of the island, hundreds of them, all exactly the same improbable shape. Grace had never been to Bohol either. She looked at the hills with genuine amazement, which pleased me. Nico had stayed with Liling. The 3 days had the quality of something both of us were slightly careful not to name directly. For different reasons, probably. I think about that trip sometimes. The tuna, the hills, the particular quality of her silence on the ferry back, watching the water. I do not know what she was thinking. I find, increasingly, that I never did. Back in Cebu, July and August passed in the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood. The karaoke from the house 3 doors down every Friday evening. Always the same man. Always the same 3 songs. One of which I eventually identified as a Tagalog love song my tutor had played me as a listening exercise, which I found faintly comic. The smell of lechon cooking somewhere nearby on Sunday mornings, fat and pork and charcoal drifting through the window. Nico, who was 16 now, occasionally joining us for meals with the slightly distracted air of a boy who was tolerating adults as a precondition of being fed. I was, in this period, reasonably content. Not happy in an expansive way. Content. Purposeful in a modest sense. I had found a rhythm. And yet, the notebook. I want to explain something about how I was using it by this point, because it had grown beyond the single entry I made after the Remy lunch. It still contained Tagalog vocabulary. That was still its primary purpose. But alongside the vocabulary, I had begun adding what I can only describe as observational notes. Not accusations, just things I noticed and wanted a record of. July 14th. Grace received a call while we were having lunch. She stepped outside. The call lasted 11 minutes. She came back and said it was her cousin about a family matter. I had heard, through the window, the word "para" spoken twice, and a name, Ronnie, which is not the name of any cousin she had mentioned. I looked up Ronnie that afternoon in the context of her Facebook friends. There were two. One was clearly a woman. The other had a profile picture of a motorbike and no other visible information. I noted this. I did not draw a conclusion. I simply noted it. This is what I mean when I say the discovery did not arrive as a flood. It arrived as observations. Individual data points, each one explicable in isolation, accumulating in a column I was not yet ready to total. August. A second call, same name mentioned. This time I was in the kitchen, and Grace was in the bedroom with the door pulled to, not closed completely, which is perhaps why she did not think to be more careful. I caught the phrase, "Basta padala lang," which I had to look up afterward. It means something like, just keep sending, or just keep sending it. The context was unclear. The tone was lighter than I expected. Not tense, almost amused. I wrote the phrase in the notebook and the date underneath it. I did not sleep very well that week. Not from distress exactly. More from the particular restlessness of a man who has identified a problem he cannot yet fully diagnose. A professional discomfort? Something is wrong with this system, and I do not yet know where the fault is. September brought another school fees request, 45,000 pesos again for the new term, which I sent without hesitation, because Nico was real, and his education was real, and whatever else was or wasn't happening, that part was unambiguous. Running total indirect support by September 2024, approximately 330,000 pesos, roughly 5,300 euros, plus 18 months of my own living costs at 18,000 pesos a month, so another 324,000 pesos, about 5,200 euros. Total outlay in the region of 10,500 euros, counting everything. My savings remained at approximately 144,000 euros. My pension continued arriving each month. None of this was catastrophic. But the notebook had 11 entries now. I had counted them on a Wednesday evening in September, while Grace was at her mother's house. I sat at my kitchen table, which was small and slightly uneven because whoever made it had not measured carefully, and I read through the entries in order. Individually, they were nothing. A name heard through a door. A phrase whose context I could not confirm. A laugh that sounded different from the laugh she used with me. But how do you write that down as evidence? You can't. It's not evidence. It's an impression. Together, 11 entries over 3 months. They formed a shape. Not a certainty. A shape. The kind of shape a plumber learns to recognize. Not the burst pipe, but the pressure pattern that tells you a burst pipe is coming, that something in this system is not moving the way it should. I am 65 years old. I have been reading systems my entire adult life. Pipes, joints, pressure, flow. The way water finds its own path when the intended path is blocked. I closed the notebook and put it in the drawer under some workbooks. I did not say anything to Grace that evening, or the next day, or the week after that. This is not cowardice. I want to be clear. It is method. A plumber does not tear out the wall the moment he hears a sound. He listens, he waits, he builds a picture from everything the system is willing to show him. I was building the picture. I was not yet finished. But I was getting close to the point where the picture would be clear enough to act on, one way or another. What I wrote at the bottom of the September page, the last entry in the notebook before the ones that came in October, was not a question this time. It was a statement. Short. Just 8 words. She may also love me. I cannot calculate this. October came, and the calls changed. Not dramatically. This is the thing I want you to understand. Nothing about this story happened dramatically. There was no moment where I walked in on something, no confrontation in a doorway, no terrible scene. What happened in October was that the door started closing more completely when she took calls. That is all. A small adjustment in behavior. The kind of thing most people would not notice. I noticed because I had been noticing things for 3 months, and because I am, by temperament, the kind of man who notices when a small adjustment has been made to hide something. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in early October, reading. I had bought a second-hand German paperback from a small shop near the Gaisano Mall, a crime novel, nothing special. And Grace was in the bedroom on a call. The door was closed. Not pulled to. Closed. I could hear the register of her voice through the door, but not the words, which was different from before. She had made an adjustment. I wrote it in the notebook when she came out. Not accusatory. Just door fully closed. Thursday, October 3rd. 4 days later, another call. Same thing. I was in the kitchen again. I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. I find cooking meditative. I had been making a version of adobo that Grace had shown me, and she went to the bedroom and the door clicked shut. This time I was close enough to the hallway, passing through to put something away, to catch perhaps 5 seconds of her speech before I moved away, deliberately. I am not a man who stands at doors and listens. That is not something I am willing to do. But in those 5 seconds, I heard Para, and I heard Ronnie, and I heard a tone in her voice. Lighter, warmer than her telephone voice usually was, that I had heard only once before, and that was a long time ago, and it was directed at me. I wrote it down. October 7th. Para. The name. The tone. November. The second call with the same name. I had begun keeping the notebook on the kitchen counter now, rather than in the drawer, because I had accepted that I was going to continue adding to it, and there was no use pretending otherwise. This call I overheard more clearly, because I was near the hallway when it started, and she had not yet fully closed the door. The phrase I caught was, "Basta padala lang," which I had already encountered in August, and already looked up. Just keep sending. The context this time was slightly clearer. She said it with a kind of reassuring finality. The tone you use to end an anxiety rather than start one. As if she were telling someone, "Don't worry, it's fine, just keep sending." I stood in the hallway for a moment after she closed the door. The street outside was making its ordinary evening sounds. A tricycle engine, someone's television, the specific percussion of a basketball on the concrete court 2 streets over. Ordinary sounds. The neighborhood doing what it always did. I went back to the kitchen and wrote down the phrase and the date and a note about the tone. I think about that moment sometimes. I was standing in a hallway in Cebu, 64 years old, listening to a closed door, writing things in a notebook. And somewhere on the other side of that door, Grace was on the phone with a man named Ronnie, who was apparently sending her money. And I had been sending her money. And I was a man who had read every forum post about exactly this situation, and had concluded carefully, methodically, from considerable data, that he was not the kind of man it would happen to. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because I think it is important to be accurate about oneself. December was when the picture became clear enough. Not conclusive, clear enough. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had gone out in the morning to the Mercury Drug on the main road to pick up some paracetamol. I had a minor headache, nothing serious. And I came back earlier than expected because the traffic had been lighter than usual. Grace did not hear me come in. She was in the kitchen, her back to the door, on the phone, speaking in a mixture of Tagalog and Cebuano that I could follow perhaps 50-50. She was arguing with someone, not angrily, more firmly, the way you argue when you are trying to correct a misunderstanding rather than win a fight. And then she said, clearly in Tagalog, because she switched to Tagalog when she was being precise, "Ay bang puti," another white man, followed by a figure. I will not give you the figure because I am not certain I heard it correctly, and I do not want to make accusations with uncertain numbers. But it was larger than any amount she had ever mentioned to me. Considerably larger. And the way she said it suggested it was an amount she was expecting to receive, not one she was discussing as a past event. I went back outside. I stood on the street for perhaps 10 minutes. A jeepney went past, painted red and yellow with a picture of a saint on the back. A child on the basketball court across the road made a shot, and the other children cheered. I stood there and looked at the street, and understood that the picture was now complete. I was not the only one. That was what the picture showed. I was one of at least two. The other being someone named Ronnie, who sent money and received phone calls from behind closed doors, who was perhaps in another country entirely. Perhaps also certain he had found something real and quiet, and not like the horror stories. I did not confront her. I want to explain this clearly because I expect some of you are frustrated by it. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you show her the notebook? But I had no proof that would survive a direct challenge. I had a phrase through a door and an amount I might have misheard, and a Facebook friend with a motorbike profile picture. She would have had an explanation for every single entry in that notebook, and the explanations would have been delivered with calm precision, and I would have been left feeling that I had accused a woman who had cooked me sinigang and taken me to Bohol of something I could not actually prove. And we would have continued, and I would have been watching the door every time a call came in for the rest of however long I stayed. And the truth is, and this is the part one finds most difficult, I was not certain enough to accuse. I was only certain enough to leave. The loneliest entry in the notebook is the last one. I wrote it on a January evening in 2025, sitting at the slightly uneven kitchen table, the street quiet outside, Grace at her mother's house. I had read through all 11 entries, and I had done what I always do with a complete diagnostic. I had totaled the results. I wrote, "She may also love me." I don't know how to include that in the calculation. And I could not. I still cannot. And that, more than the money, more than the name through a closed door, is the thing that has stayed with me. In February 2025, I told Grace I needed to return to Germany for a few months to sort out some pension administration. There had been a letter from the Deutsche Rentenversicherung about documentation I needed to provide in person, which was true. There is always some document they need in person. This is how German bureaucracy works, and will always work. I told her I would be gone perhaps 2 months, perhaps 3. I was not specific. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. We were at her kitchen table, the one with the plastic tablecloth that had a pattern of tropical flowers, a pot of rice on the stove. Nico in the other room with his phone. Then she said, "When do you go?" I said I had booked for the following week. Another pause. Then she stood up and went to check the rice, and we did not speak about it again that evening. I thought, this is how it will end. Without a scene. Quietly. The way things end when neither person is willing to be the one who says it directly. But I was wrong about that. She called me the next morning, before I was properly awake. She had clearly been up for some time. Her voice was different from her ordinary morning voice. Lower, more careful, as if she had been preparing what to say. She told me she did not want me to go. She told me that she knew she was not easy to understand, that she knew their life was complicated, that she was sorry if she had not been. She paused here, looking for the right word. Present. In the way that she should have been. She said she believed God had brought me to her, and that she did not think this was an accident, that she had prayed about it, and she believed it was true. And then she said, I love you. Wolfgang, I know you may not believe this, but it is true. I sat with the phone for a long time after she said this. The ceiling fan in my apartment made its usual sound, a faint wobble on every third revolution that I had never fixed because it would have required taking it down entirely, and I kept putting it off. The street outside was already awake. Tricycles, a vendor calling something, the school bells from 2 streets over. I do not think she was lying. That is what I have to tell you, and it is the most difficult thing in this story to say, because it would be much simpler if she were simply lying. A lie is a clean diagnosis. You find the lie, you isolate the fault, you know what you are dealing with. But I do not think she was lying. I think she loved me in whatever way she was capable of loving me, which included also maintaining another arrangement with another man. Because in her life, love and money had never been separate categories, had perhaps never been permitted to be separate categories, and she did not experience these as contradictions the way I do. That is not a defense of what she did. It is simply an attempt to be accurate. I told her I would think about it. I flew to Germany the following Tuesday morning on a flight from Mactan to Manila, then Manila to Frankfurt. 14 hours approximately. I did not sleep. I thought about the notebook, and about Bohol, and about Lilling pressing my hand in the kitchen saying God gave you to us, and about the phrase through the closed door that I had not been meant to hear. I did not cancel the Cebu apartment lease. I let it lapse at the end of the month. The security deposit, 36,000 pesos, roughly 580 euros, I did not chase. It did not seem worth the conversation it would require. The total. You want to know the total. Approximately 28,000 euros across everything, counting the support payments, the medical expenses, the school fees, the living costs across 18 months. My savings stand now at approximately 127,000 euros. My pension arrives each month as it always has. I am not ruined. This is not a story about a man who lost everything. This is a story about a man who lost something he cannot calculate, and that is a different kind of story. I am still in Cebu. I did not go home. I moved to a smaller apartment, further from that neighborhood, on a higher floor with a better view of the water. I continue my Tagalog lessons with my tutor in Manila. I am perhaps at 60% comprehension now in natural conversation. It is coming. I speak to Klaus sometimes. He is still here, still looking lighter than he ever did in the Ruhr, still optimistic in his particular way. I watch the sunsets. They are, genuinely, as good as the photographs suggested. Grace sent me a message in March. Just, I hope you are well, Poe. I replied that, yes, I was well, thank you. She sent a thumbs up. That was it. I think about her sometimes. I think about Nico, and whether he passed his exams. I think about Liling's eyes, which can see clearly now, which she could not have paid for herself. I think about whether any of that counts for something, and I believe it does, and I also believe that it does not change the shape of the picture I drew in the notebook. What I would tell you, if you came to me asking whether to do what I did, move here, find someone, try to begin again, is not, don't do it. It is not be careful, which is advice so general it means nothing. What I would tell you is this: learn the language. Not so that they cannot say things you do not understand, not as a defense, but because you cannot know what you actually have until you can hear it clearly. A pipe behind a wall sounds different when you press your ear against the plaster than when you simply guess from the outside. You have to learn to hear what is actually there. That is what the Tagalog gave me. Not proof, not protection, just the ability to hear. And hearing, even when you do not like what you hear, is better than the alternative. I am 65 years old. I have been a plumber for 40 years, and I know that some systems cannot be fixed. You assess the damage. You do what you can with what you have. You leave the building sound. That is what I did. More or less. That is enough. And that's where Wolfgang leaves us. Not bitter. Not destroyed. Just a man sitting with something he cannot fully resolve. Which is, if we're honest, the most human place any of us ever really arrives. Here at Inside the Philippines, we tell these stories because they are real. Not just this one, but the version of it playing out right now in 100 different apartments across Cebu, Dumaguete, Davao, in 100 WhatsApp conversations between men who are lonely and women who are doing their best within systems that give them very few other options. The money Wolfgang spent was real. The care Grace showed him was, in its way, also real. Filipino family obligation is not a scam any more than loneliness is a scam. They are simply forces that collide, sometimes gently and sometimes not. And the men who come here without understanding either one are the men who end up writing entries in a notebook at a slightly uneven kitchen table, trying to total a column that will not add up cleanly. What Wolfgang understood that many men do not is that the answer was in the language, not the words Grace said to him in English, which were always carefully chosen. The words she said when she thought no one who mattered was listening. Learn the language. It won't protect you from everything, but it will tell you what you actually have. And knowing what you have is the beginning of every sound decision a person can make. Thank you for spending this time with us on Inside the Philippines. If this story reached you, if you recognized something in it, or know someone who should hear it, share it with them. It might matter more than you think. We'll see you in the next one.